Well, good evening, everyone. I hope you're well as I manipulate this high-tech equipment. Microphone stand, doesn't take much to confuse me. So, we're going to be talking about half-truths tonight, which I'm very excited about. These sorts of things that we've been discussing on Sunday nights, it sort of really falls into the realm of theology. And I've got a real passion for that sort of thing. I've got a real sort of passion to be a theologian pastor, which I don't think there's enough of in this day and age. But thankfully, we've got quite a number here at Bribie Baptist. So that's great. So the half-truth we're going to be talking about tonight is when we hear people say, God won't give you more than you can handle. Now, there's a number of different scriptures that we could go to look at this. I've settled on 2 Corinthians 1, 8 to 9. So I'll just read that. If you'd like to turn and read along with me, feel free. It reads, "For we do not want you to be unaware, brothers, of the affliction we experienced in Asia, for we were so utterly burdened beyond our strength that we despaired of life itself. Indeed, we felt that we had received the sentence of death. But that was to make us not rely on ourselves, but on God who raises the dead." So that's the scripture I thought we'd settle on tonight. I'm sure you could probably think of others which are relevant, and we'll look at a few others as we go through as well. But I thought, first of all, we might talk about the concept of half-truths. Okay, everyone's probably heard of a lie by omission, which is where someone tells the truth but leaves out critical information, usually in order to be deceptive. So it's lying by not telling the whole truth. And this often becomes what we might call today false information. That's a popular buzzword which gets around a lot. Or misinformation, which it's sort of geared towards meaning something that's repeated or shared that intentionally or unintentionally misleads people, taking them away from the truth. Fake news, that's another one we hear a lot of. Again, it subverts the truth in order to influence people to a certain agenda or to stir up strife. Ironically, we have fact checkers, which are not immune to this sort of half-truth as well. They're often guilty of half-truths, supporting propaganda of various political or corporate entities, often for their own gain. And all of these things together combined, we could call them half-truths. Christianity is not immune from half-truths, and although it's perhaps in a bit of a different context to the rest of the world, half-truths have crept into the beliefs of everyday Christians. Very subtly, it leads us away from God and his complete truth. And in my mind, there's no doubt this is the enemy at work. Okay, he's done this right from the beginning. The first half-truth that we have in the Bible is in Genesis 4, where the serpent says to Eve, "You won't die. God knows that your eyes will be opened as soon as you eat it," that is the forbidden fruit, "and you will be like God, knowing both good and evil." And it reads, "The woman was convinced." And that's part of the problem with half-truths today. We become convinced of them without sort of thinking more deeply about it. And this one, "God won't give you more than you can handle," is a bit of a personal bugbear for me. It really sort of irritates me. Now, I want to be really clear. I'm sure there's some of you here who have used that with good intentions, and I'm not judging you for that, okay? I don't want you to feel as though I'm being overly harsh or targeting you, so don't feel bad about it. What I want to do with this sermon is really encourage you to think about, if you're making a statement about God, you really need to do some research on that, okay? Because that is, God won't give you more than you can handle. That is a theological statement. And we've got to determine, is that true or is that false? Or where's the truth in that? Or how does that actually really apply? Now, as I mentioned, it's often used as a well-intended encouragement to get someone to keep pushing on through hardship. And that in and of itself is not a bad thing, but it is a pretty weak statement when you think about it. And I'd encourage you to think about it deeply. Okay, I think sometimes we use it as a way to divert away from difficult conversations. No one wants to hear someone's woes and troubles. I mean, well, sometimes we do because we have compassion to help. But if they're too heavy, sometimes you just want to get away from it. Okay, not always, but occasionally. And sometimes we'll give that statement, well, God won't give you more than you can handle. And it sort of translates to, you'll be right, or get over it, or just harden up, you'll be fine. You know, and it's so typical of Australians and Australian culture to adopt that attitude. But it's a useless remark when you think about it, because it's not true. Everyone has their limits physically and mentally. And as we'll see, many of you may have experienced at times that God does give us more than we can handle. I've had one of those weeks just this week. I'm getting ready to preach about the half-truth, God won't give you more than you can handle, and I feel God's given me more than I can handle. Like, this is really helpful for my sermon, but I'd rather you not do that, Lord. But we'll see how it goes. Or are you going to maybe tell someone who's going through a really hard time, whether it's suicidal thoughts or depression or domestic violence, are you really going to say that to them? Because it's not helpful. It's really not. Imagine that, saying to someone who's in the worst place they could possibly imagine, and someone says something like, God won't give you more than you can handle. It's just not true. So where did this half-truth come from? Well, like most half-truths, we just don't know. We don't know where it originated. There's some scriptures that I have heard people use to support this statement. John 16:12-14 reads, I still have many things to tell you, this is Jesus speaking, but you can't bear them now. When the Spirit of truth comes, he will guide you into all the truth, for he will not speak on his own, but he will speak whatever he hears. He will also declare to you what is to come. He will glorify me because he will take from me what is mine and declare it to you. Okay, so this is an instance where Jesus is saying, we could use that as an illustration. He's saying to the apostles, I'm not going to give you all of this because it's too much for you to bear. And in that instance, that was true, but it's certainly not true throughout all of Christian life, as we saw in that opening verse. We've got Paul who's saying that it was more than they could endure, it was more than they could handle. So we can see sometimes God doesn't give us more than we can bear or more than we can handle, but often he does. 1 Corinthians 10:13 is another popular one to support this half-truth. It reads, no temptation has overtaken you except what is common to humanity. God is faithful and he will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with the temptation he will also provide a way of escape so that you are able to bear it. So that's another popular verse that's used to support this. But again, it doesn't apply to all things. He's talking specifically about temptations. We can overcome temptations through Christ. That's the way that he's provided for us, and we'll get to that towards the end. Or there's Isaiah 43:2 is a popular one. It reads, when you pass through the waters, I will be with you, and through the rivers, they shall not overwhelm you. When you walk through fire, you shall not be burned, and the flame shall not consume you. I'm sure you can think of other verses that may support the half-truth that God will not give you more than you can handle. And it seems reasonable at first to suggest that God doesn't want us to suffer. Yet that doesn't mean there's no suffering. Not yet. We're children of God and eventually will experience a time without suffering, and some people think that time is now. Even the Corinthians in 2 Corinthians doubted Paul's apostleship, or at least they seemed to want to doubt it to escape truth, challenging him that one should not suffer if they were truly an apostle of Christ. Yet Paul was adamant that suffering or things that are beyond what we can handle are for God's glory and for our benefit. So I thought we might look at a few scriptures that refutes the statement that God won't give us more than we can handle. We can go back to Genesis 4:13-26. Remember when Cain kills Abel and God punishes him? And Cain responds to the Lord, my punishment is too great to bear. Since you are banishing me today from the soil, and I must hide myself from your presence and become a restless wanderer on the earth, whoever finds me will kill me. Then the Lord replied to him, in that case, whoever kills Cain will suffer vengeance 7 times over. And he placed a mark on Cain so that whoever found him would not kill him. Now, that didn't make it any less bearable. It was still beyond what he could bear. It was sort of God saying, no, you are going to suffer this torment, and it will be unbearable, and I'll make sure that no one kills you to free you from that unbearable suffering. That's what it sort of comes down to. But what about Genesis 12:15? This one's a fairly traumatizing story where Hagar is forced into the desert with her young baby, Ishmael. And it got so bad that she hid her baby so she didn't have to watch the baby boy die, and she sat down and sobbed. You can't tell me that's not at a point where that was too much for her to be able to handle. Clearly it was. Or we've got Abraham and Sarah who waited so long for their son to be born only to be told by God to go and sacrifice him. Was that not too much to handle? I somehow don't think they skipped off with a tra-la-la and a spring in their step to go and sacrifice their son. That would have been devastating for them. Yet in obedience, Abraham still went through up until the point where God provided another way. We've got Job. Job's one we can go to straight away about God won't give you more than you can handle. Just read the book of Job and you'll soon understand that that theological statement is not true. Okay, Job, who lost everything, was horribly afflicted. Or Jeremiah, who was beaten, bullied, hated, imprisoned, accused of being a spy. He was beaten, he was tortured, he was mocked, he was beaten. Did I mention he was beaten? He was beaten a lot, thrown down a well, you know. And at times he prayed. This is more than he could bear. It was too much. He couldn't handle it. Jonah, thrown into the sea, eaten by a sea monster, spat back out, resurrected, and had to go and preach to the people he hated. And he didn't want to do it because he knew they were going to be saved. I'm sure he didn't handle that well. I mean, he fled at first. It was more than he could bear, more than he could handle. And then again, back to that opening verse, right? 2 Corinthians 1:8-9, where Paul says, "For we were so utterly burdened beyond our strength that we despaired of life itself." What was that burden? What was that affliction? Well, it doesn't really say what it was. We don't know. It could have been persecution, it could have been disease, it could have been any number of things, but the Bible doesn't actually tell us. But we do know that Paul said that even an apostle is going to suffer. He's going to be given more than at times you can handle. Then, of course, we've got Jesus, man of sorrows. The cup was more than he could bear, but he did it anyway. God's own son, beaten, tortured, broken and killed, crying out, "Father, Father, why have you forsaken me?" It was an event of anguish. These weren't just idle words. He was feeling this passion, this hardship. It was more than he could bear. And he asked if there was another way, if there's another way that this can be done, let this cup of wrath pass from me. But if not, your will be done. And that's a beautiful example that shows to us, even when we're given more than we can handle, we still turn to God. We still turn to God in prayer and we remain obedient. So it's just such a useless and unhelpful thing to say. Think about it. If we can handle everything, if that statement was true, there's a whole bunch of things we can just forget about. They're no longer problems for us. We don't need to concern ourselves with illness or disease. Anyone who suffered from illness or disease, whether it's physical, whether it's mental, you can understand that that's not true. It still impacts your life. Sometimes there's days where it's more than you can handle. Okay, we could do away with disability. We don't have to concern ourselves with disability. We don't even have to have compassion for other people because clearly God's not giving them more than they can handle. So why do we need to worry about it? We can do away with being concerned about suffering, homelessness, our loved ones dying. We can do away with prayer. We don't need it. We can handle everything. God's going to give us more than we can handle. We don't need to go to him for prayer. And guess what? If this statement's true, we don't need Jesus. If we can handle it all, if God will not give us more, we don't need him. We can do it all on our own. But the truth is, God does give us more than we can handle. And why would God, a good and loving God, give someone, especially his children, us, more than we could handle? Why would he do that? There's a few reasons. Sometimes God us. In Hebrews 12:6, the Lord help us to be still. All of the chaos. One of my favourite stories in the Bible is when the disciples are out in the boat. Jesus felt they'd been dealt more than they could handle. I mean, this wasn't, if you look at the original Greek, this isn't just a storm, a rainstorm. This is a fairly ferocious, life-threatening storm. Okay, and Jesus is napping. And if they could have handled it, they probably wouldn't have woken Jesus, right? But it was clear to them without Jesus, they might not be able to make it. And it's interesting to note that even without full faith in who Jesus actually was, even though they still had doubts, they still went to Jesus when they couldn't handle the situation, and he calmed the storm. We've got Matthew 26:31-35, where Peter fell into the trap of thinking he could handle anything. And Jesus said that he said that you're going to 3 times, which of course he did. And at the time when he was questioned was more than Peter could know. He did it 3 times. It was just too much. It was disciples who, and then we see those garden. I mean, if they felt that God wouldn't burden them too much, why did they flee? Why did they run away when Jesus was arrested? Too much for them to handle. And that was too much for them as well. Jesus' mother, his earthly mother, Mary was there. Some of his closest friends were there, executed. Do you think you'd be able to handle that? Do you think if someone came up and said, God won't give you more than you could handle, do you think you could refrain from being really passionately upset with them? Maybe a little bit of righteous fury, throwing rocks or something? You couldn't. You wouldn't be able to. And we've got 2 Corinthians 2, where Paul says that the Lord permitted a thorn in his flesh so that Paul would stop from becoming conceited. That's another reason why sometimes we're given too much, to prevent us from becoming excessively prideful. Could you imagine if nothing bothered us? If nothing truly bothered us, if we were able to handle everything in our stride, that could very well cause many of us to become arrogant, prideful, boastful, and suffering his too much to handle. That was for the greater good of God's people, the nation of Israel. It was a part of God's story and his grand design. Think about if you go to the gym and you're lifting weights, you're loading weights onto a point where you can't lift anymore. You're trying, you can no longer handle it. Okay, and why are you doing that? More so to find where those limits are, to see if you can push beyond them, to understand where they are so you can get the best optimal results from them. Sometimes he's preparing us. Sometimes he's preparing us for harder things to extend him. If he were to do everything all at once, make us perfect and righteous in one big hit in this mortal frame, it'd probably be too much for our tiny little human brains. We couldn't comprehend it. So here on earth, we're learning much as children learn through the years. We're learning throughout all of our lives to get to that point. So God's using these opportunities where we're given too much to be able to prepare us. And it helps us turn to one another. When we get too much, when things are too much to handle, the correct response, one of the correct responses, is to turn to one another. It allows others to be able to share their gifts. Okay, it allows others to reveal Christ in them. And it allows us, in our humility, to show Christ in us. And together as a church, it reveals the body of Christ in action. These are all good things. I mean, these things that we go through that are too hard to handle, they're not always the best at the time, but God usually has a plan for them. It has some sort of benefit. Maybe not for us directly right then at that moment, but that's all right. And sometimes we might never know in this life why God gives people more than they can handle. In Ecclesiastes 11:5, it reads, "As you do not know the way the Spirit owns in the womb of a woman with child, so you do not know the work of God." And that is truth, and that's okay. We don't have to know. It's okay to not know why God has given us too much to handle. One of those weeks, I feel like I've been given too much to handle, and I like to know that, hey, I don't know. So how should we handle? We need to seek Jesus, to seek God the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And we need to get rid of sin from our life. We need to surround ourselves with praying people and continue to push on. We need to run our race. We need, because we need the entire truth. It's the truth, the way, and the life. We need that. So, or bear everything life throws at them, I think, is prideful, delusional, or lying, maybe even all of the above. And it's a half-truth used by the enemy to attempt to draw us away from God with the premise that we ourselves are enough, that we're sufficient, that we can get through this. God won't give us more than we can handle, so we can get through this, we can do it, all on ourselves in our own strength. It's one of those self-help lies. Don't get me started on self-help, by the way. A multi-billion-dollar industry that I think is a predatory industry that thrives on half-truths. I think that's what they do. And it's like all false teaching, isn't it? All false teaching, fake healers, and religious frauds exist on half-truths. So we need to banish half-truths. We need to, even though we're sort of perhaps thinking we're saying this for the right reasons, we need to examine what we're saying when we make a statement about God. We need to go deeper into that, like I said. I'd be able to identify life fully and be able to help people. Okay, this is not about witch hunts or heresy hunting. It's about being equipped so that you can't be drawn away and that you can help others. So why does often leave us to a life and to circumstances that are more than we can handle? We've mentioned all those, but I want to bring it together very quickly, okay? Sometimes it's a tool to humble us. Sometimes it's judgment upon us. Sometimes it's an ordeal designed to bring us back to God. Sometimes it's to discipline us. And maybe sometimes God is allowing these things to happen. I know that life's not easy, and nowhere in Scripture does it say that it will be. In fact, it confirms that until Jesus returns and things are made right, we'll continue to face adversity, suffering, and at times, more than we can handle. But here's the good news. God the Father, through the Son, Jesus Christ, will restore us. Adversity, suffering, and we will reach a time where in the full presence of Christ, made righteous and justified by his work on the cross, we will never again reach a point where we have more than we can handle. Yet that's not in this life. This life and our sin is more than any of us can handle. However, God chose to lay our burdens on the back of his Son so that we do not have to bear them. That's Isaiah 53:6. So if we were to correct this half-truth and make it a complete truth, we would say it would be more accurate that God will never place more on us than Jesus can handle. And we need to turn to him. My brother, nothing but the truth, so help me God.